All right, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So now, hey, Justin, hey, Isaac. Now, how does this work exactly? Like when I say that the event's starting, is that when people actually hear? I wonder if I should actually start the event like 5 minutes early so that people get the notification. How does that work? Can y'all tell me in the chat? I know we've only got a handful of people in here right now. I know it's election week, so a little bit shorter of a week there. But yeah, let me know as far as when did you get like did y'all get a notification this morning and then y'all get another one when it starts? I just want to make sure I'm, notifying people and all of that kind of stuff. Not so much. Y'all don't have anything to say except hello, huh? Okay. So Madeline, you get something 10 minutes before the event starts. Okay. So yeah, I'm just kind of wondering how those notifications go. Did you get anything before that, or is it the first time like 10 minutes out? Okay, got it. So you get one to sign up and then you get one. Okay, got it. And I wonder if it's just that people have been out for a couple days because this is kind of a small group for APUSH. But y'all go ahead and get your questions in. All right, so let's go ahead and get that out there and get the questions in and all of that kind of stuff. And I will go ahead and begin. Let's see, trying to pull up something here that's not wanting to pull up, and I don't know why. Okay, there we go. All right, let's see. All right, get your questions in. Okay, no questions so far, no questions. All right, so the thing is, we'll go ahead and I'll talk about some things while we wait for the questions to come in. And let me go ahead and pull up what I've got here about manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine. All right, so let's take a look. Let's take a look here, and we'll get into what's going on. Let me just go into something here that I've got on the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny. We could probably use a little refresher on the Monroe Doctrine. All right, so get your questions asked. All right, but I'll go ahead and just talk for a little bit while we wait. All right, so as far as that goes, let's hide that and bring this in here. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the Monroe Doctrine. All right, so we want to go ahead and like kind of establish some context for that. Okay, so in APUSH, one of the biggest things that we do is historical context. So in those terms, if we look at the Monroe Doctrine, our historical context is that there were several revolutions in Latin America. And so that's where, they had Gran Colombia, which is now several Latin American countries, Simon Bolivar, if you know any of that stuff. But it's sufficient for context for U.S. history just to know that there were several revolutions in Latin America about that time. And then Europe, now there are some European countries, of course, the Spanish were very dominant around here. And so the Spanish are thinking, you have this rebellion, we want the colonies back. All right, so these are European colonies. Maybe we should go back in there and get them. And the United States at this time, remember that this is after the War of 1812. And so after the War of 1812, the United States is really trying to disengage from Europe. And so the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe said, what he laid out here was the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. All right. Now, of course, the other part of this, now, for one, remember that the United States was really just trying to keep Europe out of the Americas. Now, remember, if Europe has a colony already, that's fine. We're just telling them no new colonies, so that we are going to essentially recognize these brand new independent states, and we don't want Europe meddling around with it. We don't want any further like new colonial ventures in Europe. And so with that, as far as that goes, the other side of this is that we really did not have we really didn't have anything to back it up. It's kind of like, as far as that, thinking about, we don't have an army to back it up. Kind of like Andrew Jackson, when there was a Supreme Court decision about Indian removal, and Andrew Jackson said something effect of, or was said to have said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Okay, so the United States really didn't have any kind of enforcement mechanism for this, and that's important to note there. All right. So going from there, now the British kind of helped us out, because the British also felt like they had a stake in the Spanish not getting their colonies back. And so then there is the legacy. Okay, so there's the context of this, and then there is the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine. And the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine is that, we don't want, basically, Latin America is kind of seen for a long time now, not saying that that's right or anything like that, but was really seen as like an extension of the United States, like almost like colonies were playing Big Brother. And so later on, you'll get to Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt's big stick foreign policy, of which the backbone was the Monroe Doctrine. All right. So he called this the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And so just note that there's kind of a link there, because Teddy Roosevelt's going to be telling European countries, no, we don't want you interfering in Latin America. If they owe you debts, come and get that from us. Or tell us and let us take care of it. So Teddy Roosevelt's big stick foreign policy, he used the Monroe Doctrine in order to, use the Monroe Doctrine in order to justify that. So, what you see is really the United States trying to keep Europe out of the Americas, and later is intervening, using this as justification to intervene in Latin America, which especially during the age of imperialism at the turn of the 20th century. Now, then here, as we go to Manifest Destiny, okay, John Gass, American Progress. This is from 1872, okay, long time ago there, and certainly the type of painting that a lot of people would find offensive today, because what you see here is the definition of progress is very, very limited, okay? So it's these white farmers, choo-choo trains, ships, and telegraph wires, pioneers, even the Pony Express. And then over here, you've got the buffalo and the Indians, this process of creative destruction that you see that behind her is light and ahead of her is darkness. And so with that, this is really the image that comes to mind when we talk about manifest destiny. Manifest destiny really being that belief that Americans had, that it was evident, obvious, apparent, plain. If something's manifest, it is just obvious. Okay, sometimes we need for things to be obvious. They may seem likely, but manifest, if something's manifest, then it is obvious. And then your destiny, of course. Your destiny is something that it is inevitable, irresistible. This is something that you must do. That really you're kind of a power higher than you is in charge of this. That you're really not in charge of it. So it's evident here that the United States is destined, okay? It's destined by a higher power in order to be, basically in order to go from sea to shining sea, so to speak. Okay. And this goes all the way back. Really, I would say that, Jefferson, now you could take this all the way back to the Proclamation of 1763, if you think about it. Like Americans were ticked off because the king did not, Americans were ticked off because the king want them going beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So the British colonists really had a way, they wanted to go west from the very get-go. But Jefferson is kind of bringing this to a new level with the Louisiana Purchase, because remember, before the Louisiana Purchase, there'd really been no territorial expansion of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase was the first time that the United States had actually added land to the country. And so Jefferson said here, kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the 1,000th generation. So this idea that we're chosen, okay, Jefferson, who was not a Christian, so to speak, but a deist, and deist, that's something that when you think about, the belief in divine providence, okay, that God has some sort of plan, okay, so that's not just a Christian thing, that is also consistent with what a deist would say. And he said here, I shall need too the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as Israel of old from their native land and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life, who has covered our infancy with his providence and our riper years with his wisdom and power. Okay, so God is with us. He has put us here. He has separated us from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe from Europe, and he has a plan for this country, and this is the plan: to move west. All right, so that is the whole idea of manifest destiny, that westward expansion is another American God-given right. And of course, this happens, you've got the Louisiana Purchase, but also, I mean, between the Louisiana Purchase and Texas annexation, there really wasn't any more movement here. So you've got the Texas War for Independence in 1835-36. It's not like you need to know any specific details about the Texas War for Independence at that time. So, just definitely don't get too caught up in all of that. But in terms of just knowing, okay, they fought some battles with Mexico, knowing that the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto happened, is great. It certainly can't hurt. And Texas, for a while, of course, sets up the Lone Star Republic, all right, that they set up. Of course, you've got this Bonnie blue flag that is used from everything from the West Florida Rebellion to, kind of an unofficial emblem of the Confederacy. And so as far as that, Texas initially petitioned the U.S. for annexation, and the United States didn't. Okay, so there's initially a bit of a debate about manifest destiny. Certainly, the Whig Party tended to oppose this, but there are two things here. Okay, that in the 1830s, and what we've got to do is put that in a context as well, that this was a time where the idea was to have some harmony some harmony between the sections. All right. So in order, what would happen here is that, first of all, with Texas, if we were to let Texas into the Union, we would have a border dispute. And so then we would have possibly a war with Mexico, and then the balance of power between the slave states and the free states. So, basically when Texas won its War of Independence, Mexico said, okay, here in the gray is your border. And then Texas said, nope, here in the red is our border on the Rio Grande. Is the border of Texas. And so the United States would be stuck in terms of figuring out, okay, what is the boundary of Texas? And Texas certainly wasn't going to be annexed with the Mexican version of their boundaries. Okay, so annexation could equal war with Mexico. And then when we look at the balance between the slave states and the free states, okay, which was the goal of policy. Now, this is another thing that manifest destiny does, all right, to the United States, is it creates all of this new land that you can see here, that before Texas annexation, what you're looking at here is really just filling out the original states and going into the Louisiana Purchase a bit. But you see here that you bring in a slave state and a free state. In 1836, Arkansas had just come into the Union as a slave state. So in the mid 1830s, for a brief time, you actually had more slave states than free states. And so the next state admitted needed to be a free state. And so expansion, if it was seen that like, okay, this humongous slave state is coming in and we're going to this humongous slave state that maybe could be divided into like 5 different slave states later on if they wanted to. And so that's something, okay, in the 1830s, no, 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 no. And that's the idea. If you look at the political culture of the 1830s, and, I think political culture is something that is of interest today because we see how, just how toxic and polarized our political culture is in the United States right now, but it hasn't always been that way. And so, you could compare a time like this to the 1850s when people didn't care what people on the other side thought, and they saw people on the other side as a threat. Next thing you know, they were killing each other. And the 1830s, what can we do to compromise and not to tick anybody off too much? And so with that, of course, in the 1830s, like, let's not start a ruckus, but then this push to expand west, this idea that a lot of Americans had that we need to take as much land as we can. And so Texas actually received a great deal of support in, not just among the political class necessarily, but among the American people as a whole. In 1844, James K. Polk ran against Henry Clay, and the Whig Party's platform was an anti-expansion platform. And just like, see, Henry Clay was such a cool guy from everything I can tell, but the problem is that he always ran in elections where it's like he had to do an issue. Okay. It was like in 1832, it was the bank, and he was on the losing side of that. And then you see in 1844, running against James K. Polk, he is running against westward expansion, which was a very popular thing at the time. Okay, so as far as that goes, you see here a political cartoon where James K. Polk is saying, "Welcome, Texas. Welcome, brothers." Okay, you got Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, and Texas is trying to roll across the bridge into America. And James K. Polk, the Democrat, he's just trying to help them out. And then you've got the Whigs here, Henry Clay and some other people that you don't really need to know. I think that may be Daniel Webster. They're holding on to this rope. Now you see that Clay is actually, it looks like he's trying to let go because this is not a very popular position. He knows he can't get elected. He's like, I want to get out of here. But, and then note here that you've got a problem, what's seen as a political problem at that time is that the Whig Party was becoming associated with the abolitionists, who were not very popular at that time. These people who said that slavery should be gotten rid of everywhere and right now. And so there's William Lloyd Garrison. Is he about to take his hand? Who knows? Okay. But as far as that goes, the Whig Party, they took the less popular position there, and they lost the election. So the election of James K. Polk was seen as kind of a, even though it was very close in the popular vote, not so close in the electoral vote, James K. Polk is looking at this as a mandate for westward expansion. Okay, so Texas was annexed in 1845. They got a little bit creative. They did it by a joint resolution of Congress instead of the way that they usually do it, which is not coming to me at the moment. Okay, now the Mexican War is, of course, the result of Texas annexation. All right. So Texas annexation, the Mexican War. And so with this, and again, every time you see this painting, think manifest destiny. All right. This westward expansion of the United States that is seen as a God-given right. All right. So as far as that goes, when we look at the westward expansion of the United States, we've got the Louisiana Purchase, Texas annexation, And then we've got the Oregon Treaty. Now, the United States and Britain both had a big old swath of Oregon. And when James K. Polk ran, his campaign platform, or the Democratic platform, was 54-40 or fight, which I can't give you on my screen because it's up here. That basically the United States felt like they should have, what is today also like British Columbia and I think a bit of Alberta. But the Oregon Treaty settled that here. Okay, so you've got the Oregon boundary dispute that settled there. And then we've got here the Mexican Cession in 1848, and that is going to be the consequence of the Mexican-American War. All right, so as far as that goes, now a war over manifest destiny, pretty much a very one-sided war. The United States, was a much more, prosperous and larger country than Mexico at that time, and there you go. It went. I mean, it happened. It all happened pretty quickly. All right. So what we have there, the occupation of the United States, big win for the United States, and occupation of Mexico City, rather, big win for the United States. And then the Mexican Cession in 1848. And that was done by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Okay. And so from that, that is where we get all of that. And then, of course, it's still kind of controversial. All right. Just recognize that there is a controversy about that really the United States really took, whether it was legal or not. I'm not going to render a judgment call on this, but this is about half of what used to be Mexico is now in the United States. And of course, this was actually an advertisement that went kind of awry. They thought the Absolute Vodka was going to like advertise in Mexico. And it's like, oh, in an absolute world, Mexico would still be here. Now, that, of course, aroused a good bit of controversy, and Absolute pulled the ad because they sell a lot more of their product in the United States than they do in Mexico, where I don't think that vodka is even the preferred drink over there, if I'm not mistaken. So, okay, so here you go, 54-40 or fight, like the United States said, oh, we're going to keep all of this, but nope, Britain called our bluff. They're not going to fight. They're going to settle it at the 49th parallel. So in 1846, we compromised with Britain on the border. So again, just the spirit of compromise, avoiding conflict, all of that. All right, so with that, and then once we get past that, we get into the stuff that's really leading to the Civil War in earnest. All right, so we've got a few questions here. All right, what is evident? Okay, so Justin, what we see here, let me go ahead and make that. I think I can post this as a question. Okay, so when y'all ask questions in the chat, I'm actually able to do this. Okay, so what we see here is what is evident in America's future control of all of the continent. So as far as that, Justin, what is evident? It's really, I guess that's a good question. Okay, but the idea that it is just God plans it to happen. Kind of like if you think about the Crusades. Now, I don't want to put too much onto that, but if you think about how the Crusades started, it was like God wills it, okay? That God wills it, we're going to do this. It is the destiny of Christians to control the Holy Land. Now, as far as that goes, it's a very similar thing, that it's just, look, we've got this continent here. We've been moving west. Think about it. When you think about Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson sends some people to France. Okay, think about this. Jefferson sends some people to France to buy New Orleans. He's like, offer them $2 million for New Orleans and see what happens. And the French come back with this offer that Jefferson can't refuse. It's like, well, how about the whole thing for like 15 million, the 3 cents an acre? And Jefferson's like, oh my goodness, what just happened? Now, when you get that kind of thing, sometimes you think in terms of, was this divine providence? Like God must have been looking out for me. I mean, if you think about it, the Louisiana Purchase was a very, a lot of this stuff just falls into our lap. So it's like we purchase Louisiana and it's just offered to us for almost nothing. And then Texas rebels against Mexico and sets up their own country. And then they want to be part of the United States. I mean, if you think about it, it's just like we keep adding this land and people start to think, well, let's just keep on going. That I think a famous real estate agent said one time that I don't want all of the land in the world, just the land that borders mine. And so the United States is really in the mode of conquering territory, because remember that a lot of this, most of this territory was not densely populated. It was not dominated by technologically, people with technology that could compete with the technology the United States had at the time. And so, yeah, it was a conquest. And so, the war with Mexico, it's like, well, it just seems to keep happening. Okay. What ideas did Polk have and how did he get elected? Okay. So as far as what ideas that Polk, you would just, now, there may be some other things. Now, there are some cool little factoids about Polk. Like, he was the first president, I believe, to have like oil lamps installed in the White House, like in the Oval Office. Which I assume was it the Oval? When was the Oval Office? Let me just make sure about that I'm not giving you bad information. Yeah, I just hadn't thought about that. So when is the? Let's see. So the. Okay, so the Oval Office. Washington's, let's see, White House. Okay, so evidently this was, okay, so he and his successor used the Oval Rooms. Okay, so that the Oval Office was already there. All right, so that was like the architect of the White House. Interesting. All right, so as far as that goes, yeah, just wanted to make sure I was, but he had oil lamps installed in the Oval Office because that was how you lit a room back then, because he tended to work into the night. So James K. Polk was, seen as like this really hardworking president. Now, not going to be on the exam, but he made a one-term pledge. Like, you wonder, why was he a one-term president? When he ran, he pledged to only have one term. And so he was basically like, you know what, I might as well make the most of it. So he worked into the night, worked himself, really ragged and all of that. But the main thing here is he was a Jacksonian Democrat. He was from Tennessee, just like Andrew Jackson. He was also what they call a dark horse candidate. Polk isn't one of those people that like, oh, I've heard of him before. He was a big deal before he was president. Not quite so much. I mean, he was a Jacksonian Democrat, but mainly what you'll associate him with is manifest destiny. All right, so that's what you're associating James K. Polk with. And how did he get elected? He was as I said, a dark horse candidate at the Democratic convention, and they had several ballots. There were some people that were, vying for the position. I think in that year you had like Martin Van Buren, John C. Calhoun, like some people who were already big names in the Democratic Party, but they couldn't get the majority of Democrats behind them. So they eventually went with somebody. Let's see. So 1844 Democratic Convention. All right. So 1844 National Democratic Convention. If I've got okay, so yeah, let me show you this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again here. All right. Okay, we've got our attendees there. All right. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know. I didn't realize you could look at all that. All right. So as far as that goes, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now, so you had here Martin Van Buren. All right. So on the first ballot, Martin Van Buren got 146 to 83 to 20. Now, I'm not sure why he's not getting, why he's not getting it there. Okay, so what do you have to do in order to get those ballots? Okay, that's interesting because it looks like Martin Van Buren was obviously the okay, so the Young Hickory. Okay, so you got that. Let's see. So All right. So what they're saying here, 55%, but short of the now required 100. Okay, so a two-thirds rule. Okay, so what happened there is that they created a two-thirds rule at the Democratic National Committee. And so they voted to reinstate the two-thirds rule. Kind of reminds me of what happened. So some of the Van Buren delegates even voted to reinstate the two-thirds rule, which what's interesting, if y'all were following the election in Florida yesterday, that Republicans won the governorship and the Senate race, but they won them by very close margins. And won them by close margins, but they amended their state constitution to allow convicted felons to vote in Florida, which will be interesting there. That really there are some people who voted for the Republicans, but they made a decision that probably won't be so good for Republicans later on. And so as far as that goes, so yeah, Van Buren couldn't get the two-thirds. And so what happened here, now you see that Calhoun by the convention time didn't have a whole lot of support. So, you're seeing Lewis Cass, Richard Johnson, they're starting to get behind the anti-Van Buren, starting to get behind Cass. Looks like some of the pro-Van Buren are getting behind Cass as well. But then what you notice here is that James K. Polk on the 8th ballot, like he really, on the first 7 ballots, nobody went for him. But then you see that what's happening there is that the people from James Buchanan, Richard Johnson, they're going here. So interesting thing there. And then they realize that two-thirds are not going to get behind Van Buren. Two-thirds are not going to get behind Cass. And so then they go with James K. Polk. And then finally, it tends to be the thing at conventions where on the last ballot, they want it to be unanimous. Okay, so they'll have a big fight and then afterwards unanimous, which that's actually kind of similar to what you've seen, at the Republican National Convention, the Democratic National Convention recently in 2016, that once the nominee is nominated, then they want to have it unanimously acclaimed by the party. So that's just an interesting story. We just had an election in the United States. So that's good there. And so as far as that goes, that's James K. Polk, but you want to associate him with Manifest Destiny. All right, so finished answering that one. Now, how did Manifest Destiny impact American foreign policy? I would say that kind of negligibly. Now, this is really a period where the United States is more concerned with expanding itself than it is, going across the globe. Now, we do see the foreign policy problem with Mexico. Okay, so when it comes down to it, the United States might have been more diplomatic in its annexation of Texas, maybe tried to go into talks with Mexico. The Mexican War, which I haven't really treated in like I haven't really done an in-depth study of, that I believe, Zachary Taylor's army was put like pretty much as bait, like either on the other side of the Rio Grande or right on our side of the Rio Grande. They were there basically as bait. And so the United States welcomed the prospect of a war with Mexico over Texas annexation because they realized, if this turns into a shooting war, then we can get land. Now, other than that, if the United States didn't have ambitions for land, for these Western lands, then there might have been some kind of attempt at a diplomatic solution rather than a military solution. All right. So as far as that goes, we've got that. Okay. So let's yeah. And then remember that the Democratic well, wait, what was I thinking about? James K. Polk was a Democrat, but then you've got the Oregon thing, which basically we just kind of, okay, we're going to settle that with Britain. So besides those things, of course, you get into the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which isn't going to be on the exam. You get into some really obscure stuff, but I would say other than that, pretty negligible. All right. So as far as that, okay. Now, what are we talking about here, Zoe, with the South, with all the compromises and acts happening in the 1860s? Not much compromise going on in the 1860. I might get you to go in and edit that question so you're a little bit more clear, okay? Now, some of y'all are starting to get into things here. Yeah, Zoe, I would just ask that you be more specific with me here. Now, we're planning on talking about that stuff later, but if you're already on that, no, these are the only questions, that's fine. John, your question is pretty easy. I would say here that Lincoln, played a very significant role in the Union victory. I mean, it's just he was good war leader. As far as political leader, he found the right people to do what he needed them to do. And when he found somebody who was underperforming, like McClellan, who at Antietam, McClellan had, he had Robert E. Lee's battle plans and still couldn't beat him, fought him about a draw. And so Lincoln said, you're fired. We're getting rid of you. We're bringing in somebody else and who will do the job. So Lincoln was very, very flexible about that, but he didn't, as far as I know, I think that Jefferson Davis, tended to micromanage a little bit more. Jefferson Davis, who actually had like military experience, had been the United States Secretary of War. So Lincoln, found good people. He got them to do their job. And yeah, I think that Lincoln's determination to prosecute the war, because Lincoln was only elected with about 55% of the vote in 1864, which shows, I mean, it's not like Confederates, Southerners were voting in that. That was only people in the United States. And so, at that time in the Union. And so there were a lot of people that were, it's just, especially in 1863, the war the anti-war movement in the North had come up quite a bit. Now, Lincoln was also flexible. Like when you think about his decision to allow African-American units to be formed in 1863, whereas the Confederacy, just couldn't muster the support. There were people who were advocating for that within the Confederacy, but the Confederacy, it wasn't until like March of 1865, when the defeat was already a done deal, that the Confederates passed a very, very weak piece of legislation that was allowing for the formation of black military units. But, Lincoln was much more willing to take a risk at that point, and paid off for him. Yeah, but I think Lincoln, I do think that the North had maybe some advantages here and there, but only if somebody was going to use all of those advantages like Lincoln did. It certainly was a war that the South could have won under better luck, leadership, whatever you call it. So yes, I would say Lincoln was very important. All right. And okay, this is a good one here. Actually, let me do this one first. Did James K. Polk support the idea of manifest destiny? You bet he did. Yes. And that's the main thing that you need to have. Like when you look in your manifest destiny box, oh, there's James K. Polk. All right. We pull him out of there. And so I always think about boxes, about these are the things that you remember together, kind of like abolitionism, William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator, Frederick Douglass, that sort of thing. You kind of put everything in a little box together, put it in your brain. So James K. Polk, put that in your manifest destiny box, because that is the one thing that you really need to know about him. I went into some other little interesting things just for fun, since we're here and we've got only a few people here tonight. But yeah, basically James K. Polk, manifest destiny. Now, how did manifest destiny lead to the Civil War? Okay, so how did manifest destiny lead to the Civil War? Now that is basically, when you think about it, like I said, in the 1830s, before Texas annexation, you had this like equilibrium between the slave states and the free states. All right. So you had this equilibrium there. And so as far as that, as that goes, that they weren't fighting, like, remember that there were abolitionists in the antebellum period, but it was like, they were a minority, okay? Like it was a very small group. A lot of people thought they were crazy. Now, that's weird for us to think about now, but there were a great many people who thought like, hey, these abolitionists, like they're just nuts. They want to get rid of something that was a key part of the, the economy back then. People didn't really, people had different views of race back then. And so when it went west, then you've got the free soil movement, okay, that you've got people who are saying that, you know what, I don't want to get rid of slavery in Alabama, but I don't want to see slavery in Kansas. And that becomes much more mainstream. Now, of course, you can think about that in terms of today's politics. The Democrats have taken the House of Representatives. And so there is going to be this battle between like the moderate leadership of the Democratic Party and the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And so what's happening, why is it that the leadership wants to try to keep things on a kind of more of a moderate level? Because they want to appeal. They're thinking about, we want to actually be elected in 2020. We want to get a Democratic president in 2020. And if you let the extreme wing of the party come in, then what happens? Okay, so that is free soil was a great thing, like this mainstream anti-slavery movement that was accessible to people, because it really, in a lot of ways, was much more about it was more about racism than morality, really. That a lot of people say, hey, I don't want to compete with slave labor. I don't want to live around black people. The goal is really a white West, to keep slavery in the South, kind of like in the Cold War when you think about containment policy and that sort of thing. So yeah, so westward expansion, definitely one of the things leading to Civil War, because it leads to debates specifically about slavery in the West, not slavery in the abstract, but slavery in the West, which disrupts the equilibrium that you saw in the country before that, like, 1844 election. Are we going to expand West or not? So yes, very big relationship there. All right. Now, Zoe, I would think in terms of now, whatever the Republicans did in the 1860s with like central banking, I would not expect to see that on the exam. Okay, I would not expect to see that on the exam. So that's something. Now, also the Crittenden Compromise is something that might be useful as evidence if you're writing a DBQ or an LEQ, but I don't think I've ever seen that. Let me see. APUS history course description. Yeah, like I don't, for example, I don't really talk about it in my classes typically, because it's one of those things, like the Compromise of 1850 is something, yeah, Crittenden is never in here. The Compromise of 1850 is important because it's actually a piece of past legislation, okay, that it was something that passed. Now, if the Compromise of 1850 had failed, it wouldn't be a part of the course, okay? So when you're looking at, this is a survey course in U.S. history, that the Crittenden Compromise, because it wasn't passed, and Lincoln did not support it, okay, that when it came down to it, basically, Lincoln, when he took office, he said, and this is kind of a different kind of tack here. Now, of course, a lot of southern states seceded immediately, the 7 states of the Deep South, but not the other 4 that did it later. But Lincoln took office and he said that, okay, I'm not compromising on the Republican Party platform. And so the Republican Party platform said free soil. There will be no more slavery in the West. There will be no more slave states or territories, or states rather, because territories, remember, Dred Scott said that basically every territory is open to slavery because Americans have a common right to bring their property there. And so as far as the Crittenden Compromise, it was, you had Henry, I think Henry Crittenden, but a guy from Kentucky, and he's thinking stuff like, let's extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific and some other things. Now, it was also a little tone deaf, because not only was Lincoln unwilling to compromise, so Lincoln was not going to say that, okay, I want to, I want to compromise on this. But also, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, let's see. So Crittenden introduced the package December 18th. Okay, so he's trying to come up with this compromise, but and some amendments to the Constitution, stuff like that. Again, this really isn't going to be a big thing there. But the House of Representatives and the Senate rejected the proposal. Okay, so it was, basically like, if secession is about a threat to slavery or something like that, then that's then that's what they want to do. And so, yeah, that never passed. And it really wasn't, nobody really wanted to compromise at this point. That's what's important here, that when you think about the Compromise of 1850, that's really the last time that you're going to see some serious attempts at compromise before the Civil War. So 1860, Crittenden is trying to do the same thing that, Henry Clay, also of Kentucky, had tried to do 10 years before, except that Henry Clay was successful. Now, of course, he was successful in creating a compromise that ended up being very divisive when you look at the Fugitive Slave Act and that sort of thing. That the Compromise of 1850 actually ended up doing more harm than good with the Fugitive Slave Act. So the Crittenden Compromise. Now, the Homestead Act, you really won't talk about in particular typically until you start doing westward expansion after the Civil War, but it was passed in 1862. And so the Homestead Act was passed by Republicans. Now, free soil. What is free soil? Why do they call it free soil? It's not just that they want the soil to be free of slavery, but they want the soil to be free of charge. What they're saying, they basically create these land grants, and they want families to move west. So if you agree to move west and start yourself a homestead and improve the land, the federal government will give you 160 acres of land. And once you have shown that you've put a house on it, you're actually improving it, you've got a farm going, then the government will give you title to that land free of charge. And so free soil was about inviting these people to move west, but specifically that these would be like, kind of almost like a Jeffersonian sort of vision, not Jefferson's, literal life, but the kind of life he envisioned for Americans, that a nation made of independent small farmers, not unlike the early Roman Republic. So the other thing about the Homestead Act is it's one of those things that's passed. Now, that the Republicans, kind of like the Pacific Railway Act, that when the Republicans got into power, and the Southern Democrats, the Democrats were, prevalent among the Southern congressmen, they seceded and left Congress, then they were able to pass pieces of legislation like that, like the Homestead Act and the some banking acts, and also the Pacific Railway Act. And that was actually something that came up, I think, a couple years ago, if I'm not mistaken, on the exam, like basically the economic consequences of the Civil War. All right, so with that, Stephen Douglas and Dred Scott. Okay, actually, let me go to this first. Katie, I have got a video on YouTube. If you just go to YouTube and put in APUS History DBQ, it's there. You'll find it. I've got a 3-part video where I put all that stuff out there for you. And if you even, if you want to get some more in depth, I've got a writing clinic that I talk about in those videos, but those introductory videos are free of charge. And so with that, so Stephen Douglas, okay, Stephen Douglas was from Illinois and was a very prominent Democratic senator. Now, Stephen Douglas had ambitions of being the president of the United States. And if you wanted to be the president of the United States as a Democrat at that time, then you had to have the support of the South. But then Douglas was also in the North as well. And what happened in the Stephen Douglas was responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially created the conditions for bleeding Kansas. Like, it opened up the Kansas and Nebraska territories to slavery. And so as far as that goes, it opened up those territories to slavery. And from there, okay, once it was opened up, then of course you got bleeding Kansas. But Stephen Douglas, with this popular sovereignty, okay, Stephen Douglas and Lewis Cass were both big fans of this popular sovereignty doctrine, that basically instead of Congress deciding whether a territory is going to be a slave territory or free territory, then the settlers are going to decide. So popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty, let the settlers figure out what's going to happen there and go from there. And so that was his pet thing. Now, enter the Dred Scott decision, which was very, very unpopular in the North. Okay, so the Dred Scott decision, very unpopular in the North. And from there, that the Dred Scott decision saying, hey, basically you can bring your slaves anywhere, and then once it's a state, they can decide whether they want slavery or not. And so Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans were seizing on the anger caused by the Dred Scott decision. Basically, if you look at the context of Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech, what you're going to see there is that it is largely about Dred Scott and really like exploiting some of these fears that people have about Dred Scott, the same way that people exploit, politicians exploit people's fears today. So with that in mind, the Dred Scott decision comes out, which basically says that slavery should be legal in any federal territory, and that basically African Americans can't be citizens of the United States. And so Douglas, when Lincoln is taking advantage of this anger that a lot of people in Illinois felt over the Dred Scott decision, then Douglas he's kind of backed into a corner, because Lincoln asked him, okay, so you want to, what happens if there are people in a territory, settlers in a territory that don't want slavery? Must they agree to it because of Dred Scott? And so, Stephen Douglas said, you know what? If they decide as a local community they don't want slavery, then they don't have to deal with it. Now, what Stephen Douglas did there is he said what he needed to say to get elected to the Senate, but what happened is that he then blew his chances at the presidency, because from there, Stephen Douglas. Let me make sure here. Yeah, this is called the Freeport Doctrine. Okay, so the Freeport Doctrine of Stephen Douglas was that local legislation could ban slavery in the territories, not necessarily the territory itself, but if a local community said we don't want to have slavery, that's fine. And that made people happy in Illinois, because free soil was something that was very important to a lot of people there, but it ticked people in the South, the political class of the South off, and they said, Stephen Douglas is never going to be our nominee. And then, that was, you see the election of 1860, where the Democratic convention that they had that year, for whatever reason, in Charleston, South Carolina, of all places, it nominated Douglas, and then the Southern delegates walked out of that convention. And so that way you had a four-way race in 1860, which Abraham Lincoln won. And Stephen Douglas got very, very few electoral votes in that, although I think he might have finished second in the popular vote. All right. When did the Civil War become inevitable? That is a great question. Okay, now, Madeline, we're really getting into historiography here, and I would say, really for me, I think it's when Abraham Lincoln called for troops. You could say that it was at Fort Sumter, because, if you want to argue that Lincoln had to do something about that, I think possibly when Lincoln refused to negotiate the handover of Fort Sumter. That's probably when it became inevitable there. Secession became inevitable with with the election of a Republican president. So inevitability now, but you could also go into Bleeding Kansas, the Brooks-Sumner incident. For me, the American Revolutionary War, I think in terms of the intolerable acts, okay, I'm like, okay, at that point, it's kind of inevitable from there where that's going. But the Civil War, it's just so rich in historiography that I just really hesitate to try to tell you this is when it became inevitable. Even though personally, I would say that you're looking at basically the events leading to Fort Sumter. I think that I personally think that the Civil War could have been prevented in some ways, but that gets way off of the APUS history exam. I should address that sometime in a video. All right, well, thank y'all, ladies and gentlemen, and I believe that next week I have got the road to Civil War. So we'll talk about some more of this stuff with the road to Civil War and specifically the 1850s. So some of the stuff I was talking about at the end, I'll talk about that at the beginning next time. It's always a pleasure, and I will see y'all next week. Oh, goodness.